Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. Today I want to talk about separation anxiety. I have an episode on separation anxiety, but it's been a really, really long time. And so I feel like I want to do another one just to walk you through as a parent some of the initial steps of how to help your child with separation anxiety. So before I get started, I do want to thank NoCD for sponsoring this episode. NoCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they're available in the US and outside of the US. And you can schedule your free 15-minute consultation to see if NoCD is the right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That's treatmyocd.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes as well. I also have online courses, and regardless of whether your child has separation anxiety or other anxiety themes, how we approach these things, the framework of how we approach anxiety is the same. Because anxiety will shift and morph. They can get new themes, especially as they developmentally change. And knowing the foundation of how you approach any anxiety theme is so important. So you can check out my courses at atparentingsurvivalschool.com. I have a course, How to Teach Kids to Crush Anxiety, which would be really helpful for the topic that we're talking about today. All right, so let's dive into this. So separation anxiety is a normal developmental stage when our kids are very little, but there comes a time where it becomes very acute, and this is with older kids. So we see separation anxiety with kids between 2 and 4, developmentally appropriate. They get anxious about separating from their parent, they cry, they learn how to adapt, they develop regulation skills, they know their parent's going to come back, and they move past separation anxiety. So often we think of separation anxiety in layman's terms as just a developmental stage that is typical, and many, if not most kids go through some element of separation anxiety. But there is a separation anxiety disorder, an anxiety disorder, that they don't move past that stage, or it just comes on suddenly. And so onset of clinical separation anxiety tends to be more of the ages between 12 and 14. And so your child may not have ever had any separation anxiety issues, and then all of a sudden they're developing it. So I want to talk about that. That's my area. So when we're dealing with clinical separation anxiety, and you may not have been diagnosed, you may not sure what is actually going on with your child, but you'll know because they're not able to do the things that other kids their age are doing. They can't go to school, or they can't separate from you, or they can't be in another room. The spectrum of separation anxiety is vastly different for each family. And so you might have a child with acute separation anxiety where they are not able to do anything without you in their sight, without them being able to see you. And then there's other people who might have a child with separation anxiety where maybe they just can't do a sleepover, or they feel really uncomfortable doing something without a parent there or a safe person there. And it does look different for each kid. So I want to go through that. So when we're looking at separation anxiety, the first thing that we actually want to do, which I say about a lot of different issues, is I want to fully understand the origin of this separation anxiety, where it's coming from. Often parents jump right into, challenges and exposures. My child feels really anxious about separating, and so we're going to systematically separate and let them know that they're okay. But that is actually the ending, not the beginning. And so sometimes when parents try this, they hit a brick wall, their child gets worse, they don't know why, because they heard that, doing exposures is helpful, or not avoiding is helpful, and things are not progressing. The reason why that's happening more often than not is because there was all this work that needed to be done before you start to do challenges or exposures where you are systematically pulling back, your space with your child. And we'll talk about that. So the first step is finding the core fear. The core fear of separation anxiety is different for each child. And so I don't think a lot of times parents dive deep enough, and even sometimes therapists, on What is driving the separation anxiety? What's the scariest part about being apart? And unlike a lot of other anxiety and OCD themes, separation anxiety tends to be about one of these core fears. Not always, but really, honestly, I can't think of a time I've worked with a family where it wasn't one of these, but I'm sure that there's options out there. It's never like black or white. And sometimes it's both of them, but really, if you dive deep, it tends to be more one than the other, because these are two very different core fears and they're driven by different beliefs and different concerns. So let me go through them. The first one is that they are not safe without you. And so they have developed this erroneous belief that the only person who can keep them safe is you. And I'm going to talk about some renditions of this that actually look a bit different as I'm talking. I'm thinking about that. So they feel like you keep them safe, and if they're not with you, they are not safe or they're not able to do things. And so these are kids who feel like you're their anchor and the world around them is not a safe. They can't navigate the world. It doesn't even always have to be with safety. They can't navigate or do things without your help. And so, of course, they develop this really anxious attachment to you, because if I felt like I couldn't do anything, I couldn't be safe, or I couldn't function, or I couldn't do anything well without my parent supporting me and doing some of this stuff for me or being there while I'm doing it, I'd be very anxious if I was not with that parent. So that's a core fear, a fear that they are not capable without you. And we're going to dive deeper into that in a second. I just want to highlight both core fears as we dive through. No, that's the wrong word. As we go through. So the second core fear is the fear that you are not safe. That's a very different flavor of separation anxiety. This is a hyper-focused on your well-being. What if you die? What if you're not okay? What if something happens to you? Now, sometimes if you really dive into that one, it goes full circle and it goes back to the fear that they're not safe, because they're worried about you, because they're worried that if you're not around, then no one will be there to take care of them. And so then really we're back to the first core fear. But there are other times, and this is where it's a very different flavor, where the parent has inadvertently conveyed to their child on some level that they're weak, they're frail, and that they're not safe without other people taking care of them. That's very, very different. And so they are somewhat parentified and they're worried about their parent's safety, because whether objectively the parent has shown that they're not safe or this is the message they're getting, they're concerned. And it's not about their concern that something bad's going to happen to you and then you won't be able to take care of me. They don't see you as someone who takes care of them. They want to take care of you. They're worried about your emotions. They're worried about your feelings. They're worried about your safety. They're overly worried about your state of being. That is a really different core fear. But the end result is the same. It's separation anxiety. So you can see where they're almost like two different issues completely, but the end result is the same. They're both kids are very concerned about separating. So let's dive deeper into these. Let's talk about the fear that they are not safe. Now, when I say safe, I'm not only talking about that they might get hurt or they might get kidnapped, things like that. I'm talking about that they feel like they may not be able to handle their anxiety, or they feel like, what if they have a struggle? They may not be able to get through it. And so when we're talking about kids who are worried that they're not safe or capable, a lot of the work that we have to focus on, ironically, is fostering independence. Often I see parents who have kids with separation anxiety with this core fear, their child, they do too much for their kids. Now, I'll back up and say that anxiety is highly genetic. And so an anxiety disorder is there's a genetic predisposition to anxiety. And I do feel like our situations, our beliefs, our own experiences determine what theme will be picked, whether I have social anxiety or whether I have separation anxiety or whether I have emetophobia or whether I have a fear of bad guys. I think that is where the environment comes in, and that's where like our personality kind of dictates. And so some of this, our children would have had anxiety, but they're having this particular flavor because of possibly the dynamics that are going on. And I feel like separation anxiety is one of those really hard issues to work on with parents because it's a dual issue. It's a relationship issue sprinkled in with the genetic predisposition for anxiety. And that becomes hard because I feel like a lot of times, like if a child has emetophobia, we're not really part of the disorder, and we can learn the skills and teach our kids the skills to work through it. When we're dealing with separation anxiety, a lot of times it's the interaction between both the child and the parent. And part of it is what we're doing as the parent that can really exacerbate the separation anxiety or, make it better. But often I think sometimes parents don't want to hear this. It's like hard because you might be anxious yourself and you may not see it. And so I've worked with a lot of parents in my practice, in the AT parenting community, and just, online in general, where I can see clearly that they're probably doing too much for their kids, or I can see what's happening, but it can be hard for parents to objectively see this or want to hear this. And so have an open mind as I'm talking about these things. And maybe initially your gut is, nope, that's not happening in my house. But maybe try to take a step back and just really observe for like the next 48 hours or week and see, do I jump in and do a lot of things for my kids? Do I, am I like hand holding a lot of their struggles where they would definitely need me in order to do that? Sometimes we are doing the skills and tools for them, and so they get the message that they wouldn't be able to do them themselves. And a lot of times in their own house, we are micromanaging them. And if a child is predisposed for anxiety already, they're definitely going to get a separation anxiety theme because they're not being able to do anything on their own. And so parents are doing too much for them. So our goal would be to foster independence in the home, foster independence outside of the home, and, for whatever is developmentally appropriate, which you might have to kind of survey your friends and relatives of like, are your kids doing this by themselves already? How much am I doing for my child? Because when we do too much for our kids inadvertently get the message that they can't do it themselves. And that's hard because sometimes pulling back takes a lot of energy because we have to watch them struggle or we have to watch them do it imperfectly and not swoop in. The other thing we have to work on is reframing their thinking because somewhere they have developed this erroneous belief that they can't do things or keep themselves safe without you. Now, sometimes this is, they believe that they can't do things or keep themselves safe without a safe go-to person. And so some kids with separation anxiety, when this is their flavor, are fine as long as they have what they deem a safe adult. And so if they have a warm, fuzzy go-to person at school, they are doing okay. They need the handoff of another adult. Or if they go to their grandparents' house, or they go to a close friend, or somebody that they trust, the adult that they trust, for kids who feel like they don't have agency to keep themselves safe or to do things independently. And it's not a mom issue. It's not, I need my mom. It's, I need a safe adult. That is more about their inability to feel like they can take care of themselves. And we want to teach our kids that they have the tools, that they can go to other adults, but that also they're capable of doing things for themselves. And so we have to know what our child is thinking in order to reframe their thinking. And sometimes when they only think the parent can help, and normally, statistically, it's more the mom than the dad, but who is the identified separation anxiety person, sometimes they only think their mom can do everything. And part of the work is actually to show them that there are lots of adults, that adults are there to keep them safe and that is okay, especially when they're really, really young. You have a go-to person. Your teacher can help you with this, or your teacher can make sure that if you get hurt, they can take care of you, or there's a nurse at school. And so sometimes the work is really getting them to see that there are all these other people. There's always an adult who's responsible to take care of you. That's when they're little. When they get older, you're talking about like you're 10 to 18 and older. We want them to see that they also can take care of themselves and that they can believe in themselves. So it does shift depending on what is going on. The other thing I want to mention is that often separation anxiety is a secondary issue due to emetophobia, the fear of throw up, or anxiety attacks, or panic disorder. And those things in particular, it's a slippery slope where kids develop this unhealthy connection of, I'm only okay if I'm near my mom. And so those typically are not, I'm okay as long as I'm near an adult. Those are normally only okay if I'm near my mom. And a lot of that is because the mom in particular is in the trenches with their child with emetophobia or panic disorder, or when they have anxiety attacks. And there is this connection that is made inadvertently that says, as long as my mom is here, I'm not going to feel nauseous. Or as long as my mom is here, I'm not going to have a panic attack. Or if I do have a panic attack or I do feel nauseous, my mom will walk me through it. And so the primary issue is emetophobia or panic disorder, but the secondary issue that pops up is often separation anxiety. And those often happen where you're like, separation anxiety has come out of the blue and you don't understand why that's happening. And so that is something to be aware of, because in that situation, we have to pull back our hand-on-hand involvement or hand-over-hand involvement with emetophobia or panic disorder and be there to coach them, but also give them tools that they can independently do. And that's really, and to kind of communicate that when you are at school and you're feeling nauseous, what can you do? Or when you have a panic attack or an anxiety attack, what are things that you can do to keep yourself calm? Really empowering them to feel like you have the skills. I have no magic fairy dust. You just being next to me isn't preventing an anxiety or panic attack, or isn't fixing it. You're doing all the work. I'm just here supporting you. So that messaging would have to kind of shift. The other one is the fear that you are not safe. And so let's flip that around. Now, if you ask them, like, what's the scariest thing that can happen if something happened to me? Which, I mean, it seems like a dumb question because obviously that is scary for any kid, but we want to get to the core fear. And they say, well, what if you die? Let's just walk through this for a second. And you say, I know that would be really, really sad. And luckily the odds of that happening are probably pretty small. We never want to say absolute, right? But those are pretty small. What's the scariest part about me dying? And then they might say things like, well, I don't want to see you get hurt, or I'll be so sad for you. Or they might say, what will happen to me? Who's going to help me? And so again, then that's full circle. We're back to the core fears, really, that they're not safe. But if they're more worried about you, I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want someone to hurt you. They're more worried about you. Now, sometimes this happens when a parent has their own mental health issues. They cry or break down a lot in front of their child, and that's not their fault, right? I mean, if you have mental health struggles, it's really hard to control it and contain it. And so sometimes kids get a little parentified and overprotective of a parent who has their own medical or mental health issues. And so if they've had issues with cancer, or they've had their own chronic health issues, or they've been weak, or they've had their own mental health struggles, or they've been in domestic violence situations, or they've had their own trauma, the child can get the unspoken message that you're not okay and they have to take care of you. And so then they feel like as long as they're with you, as long as they can see you, they can keep you safe. And really the message that we want to work on in reframing that for them is that you are an adult and you are capable of taking care of yourself. And so it might be addressing your medical issues or your medical issues in the past. It might be addressing your mental health issues and how you are taking steps to take care of yourself and it's not their job. It might be addressing the trauma that they might have witnessed or the domestic violence they may have witnessed and the things that you're doing to keep you safe and that it is not their burden to make sure that you're safe. The other thing that I say to kids in my practice is you have no magic fairy dust to keep your parents safe. we have to have a very frank discussion about it. Whether you're in the car with them or not doesn't mean their driving is going to be any better. I've heard a lot of times kids were worried the parent doesn't drive well, or they're going to be in a dark parking lot, leaving work at night. And most of the time when we start to explore this, there had been some message the child has gotten that the parent can't take care of themselves. And that's a hard one too. We may not want to look at. We may not want to admit that. It's a hard one because we don't want to think that our child is taking on a burden that they shouldn't take on. But that is something to look at too. Sometimes it's a lighter thing, like you cry when they cry and you break down when they break down, and you're showing that you're fragile in their eyes, and the child gets concerned about you and making sure you're okay. So working on reframing that, working on our own behaviors, that's where I would focus when it comes to that type of thing. So before we even jump into exposures or doing challenges, we're identifying where is the core fear and what kind of messaging and reframing do I have to do as far as their distorted perceptions, and what kind of behaviors do I have to do to move the dial for them as well. The third thing I want to mention before we take a quick break and then talk about some concrete things to do is looking at your own lens and your own attachment. Really with separation anxiety, it's really the only anxiety theme where I really do have to dive deep with the parent as well, because it is a relationship issue. You can't have separation anxiety in a bubble. You have separation anxiety to an attachment to a person, unless you are afraid of being alone in general and you don't care who it is. You need an adult around you. That's really less separation anxiety and more generalized anxiety, where you don't feel safe unless you have an adult protecting you. It can look like separation anxiety, but really, if you're good as long as you have a human being near you that you think can take control, that has more to do with you not feeling safe in general and feeling like you can't trust yourself. But more often than not, it is an attachment issue, that the child is getting some sort of message that either they're not capable or you're not capable. And it's one of the hardest anxiety themes that I have to work with, because I have to have really raw, honest conversations with parents, where when it's other themes, it's just building the skills and teaching you how to help them directly. This one gets a little bit dicey because you don't want to offend anybody, but also you do have to look at what you bring to the table in the relationship and what's going on in that relationship. And like I said before, anxiety is highly genetic. And so it's not that your child wouldn't have an anxiety issue. It's just it's showing up in this way, which says we have to look at the relationship as well. So the last thing to look at is you have to look at it from your lens. We have to look at your attachment. What is your attachment style? Have you looked at attachment styles? I actually love looking at, I love the topic of attachment styles because I have an anxious attachment. And my husband, when he was alive, had an avoidant attachment. And so that really impacted our relationship. And so I did some major deep diving into attachment styles because it was causing a problem. So I definitely recommend looking at your attachment style, or reading books on attachment can be really helpful and interesting. Do you have an anxious attachment? Or do you have an avoidant attachment? And how does that play into your child's attachment? I have an anxious attachment, but it was really only in romantic relationships. I don't have an anxious attachment with my kids. I don't get consumed about their safety or where they are. I think in an over-the-top sort of way. Or I don't micromanage their behaviors. I let them sit in discomfort and it doesn't really bother me. It's not showing up in my child's in my child's world. It showed up really heavily in my partner world, and I'm still working on that. I actually also have I had an anxious attachment with friends and stuff as well. But all of that can be worked on, and I feel like my attachment has gotten so much better. But what is your attachment style? Did you have separation anxiety as a child? How do you feel about separating from your child? Does that create some anxiety in and of itself? If your child has had issues, if they've had medical issues, if their mental health issues really overwhelm you, sometimes a child's trauma or frailty or medical history makes parents more overprotective, even if they're not overprotective with their other kids. when you have a child that I've seen in my practice, medical issues become a very big theme for separation anxiety. So there is, the trauma of the medical, but also there is also, my child was frail and it's really hard to shift gears. I've worked with kids who've had cancer and so there is all of that stuff. And I've worked with a lot of families who have had medically frail kids and didn't have separation anxiety. And some of that might be the parent-child dynamic. Some of it might be the genetics of the anxiety disorder kind of being a genetic predisposition, lots of different things. I've also worked with parents where they've had to do IVF and it was really hard for them to have the child. And now they have one child, which was really hard to get to. And so they are very overprotective. And that can sometimes create some separation anxiety, especially if the child was genetically predisposed to anxiety, but maybe not even. It might just be a relationship, an anxious attachment going both ways. And when you're anxiously attached to your child becomes anxiously attached to you. And that can create a lot of separation anxiety. So we have to have like these raw, deep, inside look into ourselves of how do I feel when I separate? In my practice, when I would make progress with a child with separation anxiety, which by the way are the hardest kids to work with because they don't see a problem. They are happy just as long as they're, attached to their parent, they see no issue. And so they don't typically want to work on these things. The ones that were motivated were older who weren't able to go off to college or, were like 15, 16 and were still sleeping with their parents and it was embarrassing, or they wanted to go hang out with their friends, but they couldn't. It wasn't really until they got older and they saw the ramifications of the separation anxiety that they were motivated and they would come in as a willing client in my practice. But more often than not, there were some very strong breaks going on with the child and some real animosity towards the therapist because in their mind, I was going to try to break up this attachment between them and their parent, which is not the case, but that's how it was perceived. But interestingly, quite a few times I would make progress with the child and they would be sleeping independently, going to sleepovers, talking to their friends more. And the parent, the mom, had a hard time with it. And these were not parents who would have thought they would have had a hard time with it, but they would do things that inadvertently sabotage the progress. They would, bring the child back into their bedroom, or they would call during sleepovers because they were being triggered that their child may not be okay or isn't needing them. And there was a grief process there. So you got to look at these things just to be honest with yourself and see what part of this do I bring to the table. And it may be that you feel like you bring nothing to the table, and that may be. Although I have very rarely seen separation anxiety be completely one-sided. There's always something going on in that relationship. Okay, after the break, we're going to be talking about some concrete tools to work on to make things better. Stay tuned. That's what's up next.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was desperately needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realised that it was helpful to do like the exposures. Before it was like really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it, so it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com. All right, welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about the different core fears of separation anxiety, the fear that they're not safe or able, the fear that you're not safe or able, the secondary issues of emetophobia or panic disorder, anxiety attack, and then also looking at your attachment style and the things that you bring to the table. So when we're working on separation anxiety, we want to start with that, the core fear. We want to have an honest conversation with ourselves and look at our behavior from as an objective lens as we can, right? That is really important. I know for myself, separation anxiety isn't a theme with my kids. It hadn't been. But when my daughter started having anxiety attacks in the last few months, she did start to have an issue with being afraid of separating. And it was more of, she felt like she wouldn't be able to handle an anxiety attack without me. And so we moved on to like giving her very clear skills that had nothing to do with me not being involved physically with her. Like I'm not patting her or touching her or doing anything, because I wanted her to develop skills that are mobile, that she could do this at school. She could do this at a party. She could take it on the run. And so now she's not dependent on me for her to ride her anxiety attacks. In fact, she'll tell me, "Mom, I got it. Just leave me," which is great because I want her to feel like she's got the tools to help herself. She was at the park recently with her friends and texted me that she was having an anxiety attack, and she handled it herself. She has skills that she can do that don't involve me. And so it wasn't like, come and pick me up or come and help me. It was like, I'm having an anxiety attack. And I'm like, I'm sorry to hear that. And she's like, it's okay. I'm just, distracting myself and I'm working through my thoughts right now. I'm like, okay. And then she was able to reset and she was able to continue on with her friends. That's the ultimate goal. So we want to start with the core fear and figure out, are they afraid of that they're not capable, or are they afraid that I'm frail or something bad will happen to me? And when we know that, we can be much more effective at reframing their thinking. And so when we reframe their thinking, we have to get to the core fear of, what's the scariest part of being without me? Is it me? What if you're with your grandpa? Or what if you're with your grandma, right? Asking them questions that kind of help you. And what do you think? And so if they say, well, I'm afraid, what if I got hurt? All right, well, let's say you were at school and you got hurt, what would be the scariest thing? Well, no one will be able to help me. And so then I can reframe that thinking of, well, no one will be able to help you. What do other kids do if they fall at recess? And so instead of spoon feeding the answer and saying, no, you're safe at school, I want them to get to these conclusions themselves. It's so much more powerful when I don't spoon feed things to my kids. When I get them to make the connections themselves, it sticks. It's because they've had to think about it. And so saying, what do other kids do if they fall at recess? They go to the teacher aide, or another student will go get the teacher aide. Okay, and then what does the teacher aide do? The teacher aide will go get the nurse, or they get walked to the nurse. Okay, then what does the nurse do? The nurse either gives them a Band-Aid or calls their parent because maybe they have to go, see the doctor. Okay, so there's a plan at school to keep you safe. If something bad happens to you, you don't need me right next to you. There's always a plan, right? You're with other adults. They're going to help you. So maybe they say, I don't know what to do. What if I have an anxiety attack? Okay, what are the steps that you do? What do I do when you have an anxiety attack? And that's where it's important for you to pull back, because the answer should hopefully be, well, you don't really do anything, but it's nice to have you there. It is nice to have me there, and I love being there for you, but I have no magic fairy dust. What do you do to help yourself? Because I've seen you really do some amazing things to ride the wave of anxiety. So let's talk about what you do, right? So you're reframing their thinking, and it will be different for each one of you depending on what core fear is driving it. And the core fear is not, I'm afraid to separate from you. I hope that you're getting that by now. It's something deeper. If the core fear is, I'm afraid you don't drive really well, and what if you get in an accident? Okay, well, what's the scariest thing that if I get in an accident? Well, then who's going to come and pick me up? See, you thought it was about you, but it actually is about them. A lot of times when we think it's you, it is still them, because it's you by proxy for them, right? Does that make any sense, right? And so then you'll say, well, if I got in an accident, and somebody would come pick you up, then dad would come pick you up, or if you don't have a dad, right, maybe grandma will pick you up, or my friend will pick you up, or I have emergency contact, or I have an emergency person on my phone, right? For me, even though my kids don't have separation anxiety around this, I'm a widow and we don't have family here. And so I know this can sound morbid, but on my phone, it says like my kids' names and numbers and my adult daughter's number and like contacts. And so that can put my child at ease of, even if something happened to me, I have a plan. And so we're not going to just randomly reframe their thinking. We have to know what they're thinking in order to reframe it. And that's really important. The next thing that we will eventually do, once they have those thoughts and they can say, I am safe in this house, or I am capable of handling my own anxiety, or if I get hurt, I can manage. There's other people that can support me. Like once we reframe their thinking and they have what I call green thoughts, right? And I teach this in my anxiety course, that there are red thoughts. Red thoughts are anxious thoughts. They don't help us. They make us feel more anxious. What if my mom gets in a car accident? What if she's late to picking me up? What if she never comes? How am I going to walk home? What am I going to do? And the green thoughts are positive thoughts. My mom has a plan. If she never comes and shows up, I can always go to the office and call, X, Y, and Z. And so there's always plans, and plans really help reduce anxiety. So the reframing their thinking will change depending on what their thoughts are. And so often with my kids in general, and this isn't a fundamental anxiety tool, I'll say, what are your red thoughts? And then what are your green thoughts? And green thoughts aren't just like warm, fuzzy, rah, rainbows and butterfly thoughts. They're concrete things, right? What if I throw up? Well, the likelihood of you throwing up is probably small, but if you did, you could go to the nurse. You've thrown up before and you've been able to handle it, right? Green thoughts. We don't want to spoon feed green thoughts. We want them to grow their green thoughts themselves, because those are the ones that stick. I teach this all in my How to Teach Kids to Crush Anxiety course. Because I don't do reframing thinking to this degree with people with OCD, because then it turns into mental compulsions. So if you're dealing with both, you have to be kind of careful. And then we do exposures, and exposures are systematically separating, whatever that may look like, so that your child can tell themselves their green thoughts and learn from experience that they can survive being separated from you. And this might be very small baby steps. It might be using walkie-talkies and your child is in one room and you're in the other for like 2 minutes. I mean, it depends on how severe the separation anxiety. It might be building up to you walk around the block while they're home alone with their dad. Or it might be you go out and get Starbucks for 20 minutes and they stay home with somebody else and they don't text you. It will look different, but the goal is to systematically, slowly build up their tolerance for separation. And then there's a great processing that can help afterwards. I know that might have been hard for you, but you also handled it. And you should feel so proud that you handled it. Even if they were crying and screaming and it was horrible, you survived being away from me. Because even though we love to be together, you don't need to be with me in order for you to have a good time or for you to be able to function. And so that processing afterwards is kind of a powerful tool that we want to do. And then sometimes if they were able to navigate something, or they were able to play a game without you there, or they were able to go to school without you, we want to highlight that. They might come back and refute it and be like, no, it was horrible and I couldn't do it. But you did do it. I wasn't with you and I came back and I picked you up. And yeah, it might have been upsetting and hard, but you were able to do it. The other thing is, when our kids are doing exposures, the small systematic exposures, we have to be able to handle some of their distress. Because if you have this concept that my child can never have any distress, zero distress, you really won't be able to move the dial with really any anxiety theme. Because part of facing your fears and being brave is also sitting in discomfort and distress. Now, does that mean your child has to be writhing and screaming and rip from you? No, that's obviously not good, right? But does it mean that my child is maybe crying and isn't really happy about it and doesn't want me to leave, but their dad is right there? That is okay, right? Because with separation anxiety, they're never going to be, or I don't want to say never, but it's rarely that they are on board with the exposures. It's rare that I've ever worked with a child that's like, yes, mom, go to Starbucks while I'm sitting here with my grandparents. I'm going to love that. If they have a hard time separating from their parent and the grandparent isn't like a go-to replacement, they may not love that and they may cry. But if we show our own anxiety, are you okay? Are you sure? If you're not okay, you can just text me and call me, or I'll be right back. And don't worry, I'll be right back, and I'll let you know every step of the way. That's my anxiety coming through, and it inadvertently is conveying to my child that I don't think you can handle this. Where if I could be like, I'm going to be gone for a little while, and when you're doing exposures, as you progress through exposures, it's best to not give them a time frame of when you're going to be back. You might build up to that, but then they're not watching the clock. It's like they're just dealing with this time of, I'm with my grandparents right now, or I'm with my friend, and I'm going to be okay. But if you proactively tell them that if they're having a hard time, you're going to be right back. And if they're crying, that they're right back. And telling the caregivers, oh, if she's having a hard time, just call me. Even if you're doing an exposure, you're kind of undoing the exposure in that moment because you are putting all your anxiety inadvertently onto the situation. And your child will pick up on that very easily because they're sponges, and it won't work. Or if you are, doing an exposure in the house and your child is uncomfortable, swooping in and coming back will kind of undo that work. And so it is hard. And a lot of times parents who are dealing with separation anxiety with their kids have to do their own work. They have to have their own therapist on how do I handle my child being uncomfortable, being somewhat distressed, and not swooping in. Because part of that too, that sometimes creates separation anxiety, is that the parent doesn't ever let the child have distress or be uncomfortable and swoops in and rescues them more often than they think they do. And it does create this message of you are not capable. It's not conscious. And so it's very rare that I have a parent that even has an awareness of this. And even when I bring it up or I can clearly see it, the parent will be like, no, we don't do that. Or that's not an issue for us. Very rarely do I see a parent have insight when it comes to this. But if we are doing that, if we're not able to let our child cry or figure it out themselves or problem solve, and we wind up swooping in all the time and fixing it with their friends, or fixing it with their toys, or fixing it when they're upset, or fixing the problem. You wanted the red cup, not the blue cup. Here's the red cup, right? Building resiliency is letting them sit with their discomfort. And so that can sometimes create separation anxiety because the child's thinking, I can't handle this. My mom always comes in and she fixes it. And so she's not with me. No one's going to fix this. So just something to look at and do your own self-work. That is the last part of this process, is doing your own self-work, whether that's with a therapist or doing your own authentic, real, raw observation of yourself and what's going on so that you can work on that as well. Well, I hope that you found this helpful. I know separation anxiety is tough, and I feel like whenever I talk about separation anxiety, I have to have a little bit more of a frank discussion than is my normal comfortable style, because I never want anyone to feel bad. But I do feel like it is one of those themes where we have to look at ourselves as much as we have to look at our kids, because what we're doing inadvertently grows separation anxiety. And so that's why we have to look at it. I hope that you are finding my podcast helpful in general. I hope that you are finding the sparkle in everything you do. And I will talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.